discovered him in the hallway, gazing at the old family photos that adorned the wall. The soft glow of the dim light cast long shadows, softening his features, though his eyes held an unreadable depth. He didn't notice my approach at first, but when I drew closer, he turned to me with a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Do you remember that trip to the lake?" he asked, gesturing toward a picture of us from years ago, sunburned and beaming as we splashed in the water. "Of course," I replied with a laugh. "You had this grand plan to catch the biggest fish, convinced it would be a piece of cake. Instead, you ended up with a cold." He chuckled softly, a genuine sound that momentarily eased the tension. "Yeah, I suppose some things never change." We fell into silence, both of us lost in our memories, yet the air felt heavy, as if he was holding something back. I watched him, hoping this would be the moment he would finally share what was on his mind, but he merely nodded at the photo before turning away and retreating to his room without another word. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions. A part of me wanted to confront him, to demand answers, to finally grasp what lay beneath the surface. But each time I considered it, I hesitated, fearing I might only push him further away. The following day, I thought a change of scenery might help, so I suggested we take a drive. He seemed uncertain at first, but eventually agreed, and soon we were cruising down winding country roads, the windows down, the fresh air filling the car. For the first time in days, he appeared at ease, a subtle smile flickering across his lips as we traveled in a comfortable silence. As the sun sank low in the sky, we stopped by a tranquil lake we had visited years ago. It was deserted, the water smooth and still, reflecting the colors of the sky above. We perched on the car's hood, watching the sunset, and for a fleeting moment, it felt like the good old days, just two family members enjoying a serene evening together. But just when I thought the tension had finally dissipated, he turned to me with a serious look. "Uncle, do you ever feel like there's more you could have done? Like maybe you overlooked something significant?" His question caught me off guard, but I could tell there was more beneath the surface. "Yeah," I replied cautiously. "Sometimes we don't recognize the significance of things until later, but life has a peculiar way of offering us second chances." He nodded slowly, his eyes drifting over the lake. I don't know. Sometimes I feel trapped. Like no matter what I do, I'm not where I'm meant to be." His voice was laced with frustration, as if he were wrestling with something he couldn't quite grasp. Before I could reply, he exhaled deeply, rubbing his hands together as if trying to find his footing. "Maybe it's silly," he murmured, almost to himself. "Maybe I just need to let it go." "Hey, it's not silly," I said gently. "Sometimes things don't make sense right away, but that doesn't mean they aren't worth figuring out. You don't have to have all the answers right now." He glanced at me, a flicker of relief in his eyes. "Thanks, Uncle. I guess I needed to hear that." The drive back was quiet, but it felt like a comfortable silence. There was an unspoken understanding between us, a shared recognition of the weight we both carried. As we pulled into the driveway, he turned to me, offering a small smile. "Thanks for today," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Anytime," I said, giving his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "You know I'm always here for you, right?" He nodded, his eyes lingering on me for a moment before he stepped out of the car and walked inside. I watched him leave, feeling a strange blend of relief and concern. We had made progress, but there was still an unspoken weight, a shadow lingering at the edges of our discussion. In the days that followed, the dynamic between us began to change. The pauses in our conversations became shorter, and our talks grew a bit more expansive. I started to catch glimpses of the nephew I once knew, the one who was open and carefree, unencumbered by whatever burdens he had been carrying. We spent more time together, swapping stories, cooking meals, and even enjoying a few classic films late into the night. Yet, despite the joy of this renewed connection, I couldn't shake the feeling of an underlying tension. It was subtle, almost undetectable, but it lingered like a storm brewing in the distance. I couldn't quite identify it, but I sensed it in the fleeting glances and in those quiet moments when words escaped us, leaving the air thick with an unnameable feeling. One evening, as we lounged on the couch, a soft conversation erupted into laughter that left us breathless, tears streaming down our faces. But as the laughter subsided, he turned to me, his expression inscrutable, his gaze more intense than I had ever seen. "Uncle," he started, his voice barely a whisper. "Have you ever felt like you were meant to be closer to someone, but something holds you back?" The question hung heavily between us, charged with unspoken emotions. I paused, uncertain of how to reply. A part of me sensed the direction he was heading, but I wasn't sure I was ready to confront it. "Well," I said slowly, choosing my words with care. "I think sometimes we feel a pull towards certain people in ways we can't fully grasp, but that doesn't necessarily mean we should act on those feelings." He nodded, his eyes falling to his hands, yet the tension in his stance was unmistakable, his shoulders taut. For a fleeting moment, I thought he might let it slide, that we could bypass the heavy conversation and slip back into our familiar rhythm. But then he lifted his gaze, locking eyes with me in a way that caught me off guard. "What if it's something you can't overlook?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, each word tinged with a vulnerability that pierced through me. I inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of his questions envelop me. Sometimes, it's wise to take a step back, to allow ourselves the space to process our emotions before acting on them. Things can spiral when we rush without reflection. He leaned in closer, his face just inches from mine, his eyes drifting to my lips, and I felt my resolve wavering, the unspoken tension between us finally giving way. I remained still, holding my breath as he closed the gap, his lips brushing against mine in a gentle, tentative kiss. Time seemed to freeze, the silence stretching as his hand glided from my shoulder to my cheek, his touch soft and almost reverent. I didn't pull away. I didn't stop him as his lips met mine again, this time with more urgency, and warmth surged through me, a strange sense of belonging amidst the turmoil. He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching mine, as if he was waiting for me to speak, to halt him, to declare this a mistake, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I didn't want to. Instead, I found my hand reaching for him, resting on his arm, anchoring myself in the reality of this moment. "This feels..." "I don't know," he murmured, his forehead resting against mine. It felt as if this was how it was meant to be. I struggled to find the right words, unable to articulate the whirlwind of feelings churning within me. Yet, for the first time in ages, everything seemed to align perfectly, even if it defied logic. His fingers brushed gently along my jawline, igniting a spark within me, and I realized we were on the brink of something irreversible. He leaned in once more, his lips meeting mine in a kiss that was both tender and urgent, echoing the silent longing in my heart. I surrendered to the moment, his warmth anchoring me while my thoughts raced with the weight of our actions. But I pushed those thoughts aside, unwilling to question what was unfolding. I allowed myself to be enveloped in the intimacy of the kitchen, our only witness to this shared experience. His hands found their way to my waist, drawing me nearer, and I could feel the rhythm of his heartbeat, steady and reassuring, syncing with my own. For what seemed like forever, we remained in that embrace, lost in the serene closeness, the unspoken feelings finally conveyed through the gentleness of his touch and the heat of his kiss. I understood we had crossed a threshold, that nothing would ever be the same again, but in that moment, it didn't matter. All that counted was the sensation of his arms around me, the solace of his presence, and the undeniable truth that we were exactly where we belonged. Eventually, he pulled away, his gaze a mix of softness and intensity as he studied me, his hand still resting on my waist. "I don't know what this means, but I don't want it to end." I swallowed hard, my thoughts racing, yet I knew he was right. Our bodies had intertwined, lost in the emotions that enveloped us. We were swept away, unable to resist the natural flow of what was happening. In that instant, everything else faded away. I lifted my hand to his face, feeling the warmth radiating from his skin. Our eyes locked, and I offered him a soft smile, my heart racing in sync with his. In a whisper, I let go of my reservations. Let's not hold back. With our lips just a breath apart, the air was thick with anticipation, and we reveled in the moment's intensity. He smiled back, a blend of relief and something deeper flickering in his eyes. As we stood entwined, I realized we had finally mustered the courage to confront the truth and embrace the feelings we had both been evading. The kitchen was serene, the quiet night wrapping us in a comforting sense of belonging. For the first time, I felt completely at home. The days that followed were surreal, each moment infused with a curious mix of the familiar and the new that lingered in my mind. We had settled into an unspoken rhythm, a shared understanding that felt like a secret just between us. Yet, there was an intensity to it, a pull that neither of us fully acknowledged, drawing us closer together. Every interaction was colored by the memory of that night in the kitchen. One late evening, I found myself gazing out the window at the still street below. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator, and I thought I was alone until I heard his footsteps approaching. He entered quietly, his presence comforting, yet my heart raced at the sight of him. Our eyes met, and for a long moment, silence enveloped us, making words feel unnecessary. This silence carried the weight of everything we hadn't expressed, all the truths we had been skirting around. Tonight, it felt as if that weight was finally too heavy to bear. He moved nearer, his face revealing a mix of openness and caution. "Uncle," he started, his voice barely audible. I can't quite wrap my head around this." His eyes locked onto mine, a brief glimpse of vulnerability flickering across his features. I inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of his words envelop me. "I don't have all the answers either," I responded softly. "But perhaps we don't need to figure it all out right now." He nodded, his demeanor softening as he closed the gap between us. With each passing moment, the space between us diminished, and I felt the comforting warmth of his presence, the unspoken bond that connected us. His hand reached out, gently resting on my arm, his touch offering silent comfort. "I just don't want this to fade away," he said, determination threading through his quiet tone. "I don't want us to act like it never happened." I held his gaze, the sincerity in his eyes reflecting my own feelings. "Neither do I replied, my voice barely a whisper. The silence that enveloped us was thick with understanding, and in that instant, I realized we had crossed a line from which there was no return. Yet, there was a sense of tranquility in that realization, a quiet acceptance of the journey we had embarked upon. He leaned in closer, his hand slipping from my arm to intertwine with mine. It was a simple act, yet it conveyed so much, a silent vow that needed no words. We stood there, hands joined, as a sense of calm washed over us while the night continued to unfold. As the weeks unfolded, we found ourselves walking the fine line between the comfort of the familiar and the excitement of the unknown. Our conversations flowed softly over cups of coffee, and stolen glances across the room ignited a tension that was both exhilarating and daunting. Doubts occasionally crept in, whispers of uncertainty that brushed against my thoughts, yet I always found solace in his presence, in the quiet strength he offered. One evening, while we relaxed in the living room, he turned to me with a pensive look. "Do you ever think about where this is all heading?" he asked, catching me off guard. I paused, searching for the right response. "Sometimes, it's okay not to have all the answers," I replied thoughtfully. "Being present in the moment can be enough." He nodded, his expression deep in thought, as if weighing my words. "I just don't want to lose this," he said softly but firmly. I reached out, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "We're in this together," I assured him. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it side by side." A small, relieved smile spread across his face, and for a brief moment, the burden of his worries seemed to lift. We settled into a comfortable silence, the shared companionship soothing the uncertainties that hung in the air. The future felt vast and unpredictable, but in that instant, it didn't matter. We had each other, and that was more than enough. The weeks that followed blurred together, each day merging into the next as we explored the intricacies of our deepening bond. Moments of doubt and hesitation arose, yet we consistently found our way back to one another, united by a shared determination. The quiet times in the kitchen, the exchanged glances, and the late-night whispers became threads that wove us closer, creating a tapestry of understanding and trust that strengthened with each passing day. There were moments when the reality of our circumstances weighed heavily upon us, almost unbearable in its intensity. We existed in secrecy, our bond a hidden treasure known only to the two of us. While this secrecy drew us closer, it also created an unbridgeable gap between us. I often found myself awake at night, pondering the choices we had made, questioning whether we were fated to remain in the shadows indefinitely. Yet, amid the doubts and fears, there was an undeniable strength in our relationship, a resilience that saw us through the darkest times. We discovered comfort in one another, a sanctuary from a world that failed to grasp the profound nature of our connection. In that sanctuary, we experienced a tranquility unlike anything we had known before. One evening, as we lingered in the kitchen, a shared understanding enveloped us. The future loomed uncertain, fraught with obstacles, yet in that moment, we recognized that we were precisely where we belonged. We didn't seek validation from the outside world, we needed no one else's approval because we had each other's understanding. In that mutual comprehension, we unearthed a strength that sustained us. He reached for my hand, and in that instant, the chaos of the world faded, leaving only the comforting certainty of our bond. We sat in silence, hands intertwined, a wordless vow that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would confront them side by side. In that vow, we discovered a peace that transcended language, a quiet assurance that regardless of what the future might bring, we would be all right. As we remained there, the kitchen illuminated by the gentle glow of the overhead light, a wave of calm washed over me. The road ahead was shrouded in uncertainty, fraught with obstacles, yet in that moment, I felt an unbreakable connection between us, a bond that would see us through any storm. As the night deepened, we sat in silence, our hands intertwined, a silent vow that whatever challenges awaited us, we would confront them side by side. In the tranquility of that evening, I discovered a profound sense of peace I had never experienced before. Within that serenity, I unearthed the courage to welcome the future, ready to tackle the hurdles that lay ahead, secure in the knowledge that we had one another. As night transitioned into dawn, I was reassured that together, we could handle whatever came our way. Our bond was unyielding, a quiet comfort that promised we would be all right, no matter what the future held. Our journey had been one of exploration, leading us to a depth of understanding and trust that transcended words. As we sat in the stillness of the kitchen, hands clasped, I realized we had discovered something that would sustain us. A single, unguarded moment had crossed boundaries we had never imagined, altering everything. I never expected that a tranquil evening alone would become a cherished memory for years to come. It was one of those serene nights, seemingly untouched by the chaos of the outside world. With my brother's family out, I was gifted with the rare luxury of solitude in a home usually bustling with life. I savored these moments when silence replaced the usual clamor, allowing me to finally relax. After a long day, the thought of a hot shower felt like pure indulgence. After a simple dinner, I turned off the downstairs lights, checking each room as was my routine. It was a habit, ensuring everything was in order before heading upstairs. My nephew Sean had just returned to stay with us after a few months away at school, and we were adjusting to his presence again. He was a great kid, but his endless energy and restless teenage spirit often disrupted the quiet routine I had grown accustomed to. The house felt deserted, or so I believed, as I made my way upstairs, eager to relax. I tossed my clothes into the laundry basket and turned on the shower, allowing the hot water to flow. Steam quickly filled the bathroom, wrapping around me like a warm blanket, instantly easing my tension. Standing beneath the cascading water, I let the stresses of the day dissolve away. With my eyes closed, I took deep breaths, savoring the solitude and the comfort of my own thoughts. Just as I began to fully unwind, a sound from down the hallway broke my concentration. It was faint, barely cutting through the sound of the running water, but it was there, a creak in the floorboards. I hesitated, dismissing it as the typical noises of an aging house. But then it came again, this time closer, a slow, deliberate step that felt too intentional to ignore. The silence returned, thick and oppressive. I chuckled softly at my own paranoia. It was likely nothing more than my imagination playing tricks on me. Yet, as I continued to listen, I became aware of a soft, steady sound of breathing. It was too close, almost rhythmic. Just when I thought I was imagining things, I noticed a shadow creeping across the narrow beam of light at the bottom of the door. My heart raced as the realization hit me. Someone was standing just outside. In that instant, every sense was heightened, every nerve tingling. Who could it be? I recalled that my brother and his wife were out, and it seemed unlikely they would return so soon. Then it struck me, my nephew, Sean. Could it be him? I called out, attempting to pierce the silence, but my voice wavered, as if a part of me was reluctant to disturb whatever lingered on the other side of the door. Is anyone there? For a brief moment, all I could hear was my own breathing and the soft drone of the shower. Then, out of nowhere, a gentle voice broke the silence. It was low and barely discernible, unmistakably Sean's. "Sorry, I didn't mean to. I didn't realize you were here," he hurriedly explained, his words tumbling over one another, revealing his discomfort. He must have assumed the bathroom was empty or that I was downstairs. I let out a sigh of relief, trying to dispel the tension that had gripped me just moments earlier. "No worries," I replied, my tone perhaps a bit too upbeat, even to my own ears. "I'll be out in a minute." Yet, even after he left, an odd feeling lingered. The way he hesitated outside the door, the quiet intensity of his presence, it all felt strangely charged, making it difficult to fully relax. I attempted to dismiss it as I continued my shower, but the thought kept resurfacing. When I finally turned off the water and stepped out, the house was once again enveloped in silence. I dried off, dressed quickly, and retreated to my room, hoping to forget the awkward moment. However, as I lay there, the stillness of the house felt different, almost eerie. I could hear faint sounds from Sean's room, the subtle movements of someone else who, like me, was still awake. Hours slipped by, and sleep eluded me. The image of Sean standing outside the bathroom door, caught in that moment of uncertainty, replayed in my mind, keeping me on edge. There was something in his expression, something I couldn't quite identify, that made the encounter feel more significant than it should have been. The next morning, I woke early, hoping breakfast would restore some sense of normalcy. I made my way downstairs to find Sean already in the kitchen, cradling a cup of coffee and appearing much more at ease than he had the previous night. He looked up as I walked in, a casual smile spreading across his face. "Morning," he said, as if everything was perfectly normal. I managed to smile in return, attempting to convince myself that the previous night had been nothing but a figment of my imagination. "Morning," I replied, pouring myself a cup of coffee. For a brief moment, we stood in an uncomfortable silence, each of us feigning interest in our morning rituals. Yet, the sense of unease that had settled in since last night lingered heavily in the air. It felt as though an unspoken tension hung between us, something neither of us dared to confront. "So, did you sleep well?" I ventured, hoping to spark some light conversation. Sean shrugged, taking a deliberate sip of his coffee. "Yeah, I guess. Took me a while to fall asleep, though." I nodded, at a loss for words. Yeah, me too. Must be something in the air, right? He offered a half smile, but there was a guarded look in his eyes, a hint of something I couldn't quite decipher. He quickly finished his coffee, avoiding my gaze as he placed the mug on the counter. Well, I need to head out for a bit, he said, grabbing his bag from the chair. I'll see you later, he added. Sure thing, I replied, watching him leave the kitchen, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Once again, I was left alone with my swirling thoughts, trying to make sense of the peculiar encounter. The day slipped by in a haze, my mind repeatedly drifting back to the events of the previous night. I attempted to immerse myself in work, seeking distractions to pull me away from the relentless cycle of questions swirling in my mind. Yet, despite my efforts, I couldn't shake the nagging sensation that there was something deeper behind that fleeting moment. It wasn't until the house fell silent later that evening, with everyone tucked away in their beds, that the full impact of that night hit me. I found myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts a chaotic jumble. What had begun as a simple evening at home had morphed into something more complex, a tension that was impossible to overlook. As I lay there enveloped in silence, I came to a realization: whatever had transpired that night was not going to simply disappear. There was more to it, more than I was ready to confront. Whether I liked it or not, I would have to face the truth. The days that followed were fraught with tension, filled with moments that felt both ordinary and strangely charged. Living under the same roof, sharing spaces, and brushing past one another in the hallways suddenly became complicated in ways I hadn't expected. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was overanalyzing a mere awkward encounter. But no matter how hard I tried to dismiss it, the atmosphere between us had shifted. Before long, my suspicions began to take hold. Every glance, every brief moment of eye contact seemed to carry an unspoken weight, laden with significance. I often caught Sean observing me, his face inscrutable as if he were trying to decipher something. Just as quickly, he would avert his gaze, pretending as if nothing had occurred. The tension between us was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, yet I was at a loss for how to address it without making matters worse. One evening, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, surrounded by a chaotic spread of work papers that my mind couldn't seem to engage with. The television hummed softly in the background, but its noise did little to mask the palpable tension that hung in the air. I attempted to immerse myself in a familiar rerun when I heard the faint sound of Sean's footsteps approaching down the hallway. He paused in the doorway for a moment, then stepped inside. I looked up and met his gaze briefly before he quickly averted his eyes, shoving his hands deep into his pockets. His relaxed stance sharply contrasted with the uncertainty etched on his face, which seemed almost fragile. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice unusually gentle. I managed a smile and gestured to the empty spot next to me. "Sure, go ahead." He settled into the chair, maintaining a careful distance, but the silence that enveloped us was thick with unspoken words. We both focused on the screen, pretending to be absorbed in the show, yet it was evident that neither of us was truly watching. I could sense his presence beside me, every subtle movement creating an electric tension in the air. After a few moments, he cleared his throat, shattering the stillness. "I feel like things have been weird lately." His unexpected candor caught me off guard, and I turned to him, choosing my response with care. "Yeah," I replied, acknowledging the truth of his words. "They probably have." He nodded, his eyes locked onto the coffee table. I never intended for that night to feel, well, uncomfortable. It just caught me off guard, I suppose. His words lingered in the air, and I sensed the unspoken thoughts between us, the part we both hesitated to confront directly. The tension and curiosity were palpable, simmering just beneath the surface. "I understand," I replied, keeping my tone light even as my heart raced. "It was just one of those moments, I guess, nothing to worry about." He met my gaze then, his expression softening a bit. "I didn't mean to make you feel uneasy. I truly didn't." I wanted to comfort him, to dispel the awkwardness hanging between us. Yet, I found myself studying his face, curious about what had been on his mind that night. There was an inscrutable depth in his eyes, a quiet intensity that made it difficult to look away. "It's okay," I finally said, my voice softer than I had planned. "We're family, after all. Things happen." We fell silent once more, each of us wrapped in our own thoughts, but the tension was unmistakable, pressing down like a weight neither of us could shake off. I longed to say something to ease the silence, to lighten the atmosphere, but the words eluded me. Instead, I felt the air grow heavier, as if something unspoken was settling between us. Eventually, he shifted next to me, his arm brushing against mine, and that unexpected touch sent a thrill through me. I tried to dismiss it, convincing myself it was just a casual contact, nothing significant. Yet, the moment stretched on, lingering in a way neither of us seemed ready to break. He let out a soft sigh, leaning back against the couch, his gaze wandering to the ceiling. "It's odd, isn't it?" he murmured, almost to himself. I frowned and turned to face him. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Just everything, I suppose. Being here feels different now." There was a touch of nostalgia in his voice, a quiet sadness that took me by surprise. I hadn't anticipated him to be so open, to lower his defenses even slightly. For a brief moment, he appeared younger, more vulnerable, and I felt a wave of protectiveness wash over me, a need to reassure him that all was well. "I understand what you mean," I said gently. "Sometimes it seems like everything shifted while we weren't paying attention." He looked at me then, his eyes reflecting a blend of emotions I couldn't fully grasp. There was something raw and unguarded in his expression, and I felt my breath hitch, the weight of the moment enveloping us both. We remained still, silent, as if we were both anticipating something significant. Just then, the sound of a car door slamming outside shattered the moment, pulling us back to reality. A mix of relief and disappointment surged through me. I was thankful for the distraction but couldn't shake the tension that still hung between us. Sean cleared his throat, sitting up straighter, and I noticed the familiar guarded look return to his face, as if he were shutting himself off once more. "I should probably head out," he said quietly, almost with regret. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a casual smile. "It's getting late." He stood up, pausing for a moment before nodding and making his way to the door. I watched him leave, a strange emptiness washing over me as he vanished down the hall. I wanted to call out to him, to say something that would close the gap between us, but the words eluded me. The tension lingered, a silent presence just beneath the surface, and I sensed it wouldn't dissipate anytime soon. In the days that followed, the pattern persisted, each of us carefully navigating the unspoken strain that had settled between us. We attempted to maintain a facade of normalcy, pretending as if nothing had shifted, yet it was impossible to overlook the palpable difference in the air. Every exchanged glance and unintentional brush of hands felt charged, heavy with unexpressed emotions, and I couldn't shake the impression that we were both holding back. One afternoon, as I was about to leave, I unexpectedly bumped into Sean in the hallway. He looked up, surprised, and for a brief moment, we simply stood there, locked in a gaze. I could see the same turmoil reflected in his eyes, the same uncertainty that had been haunting me. "Hey," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Hey," I replied, my heart racing. A long silence stretched between us, each of us waiting for the other to break the stillness that had lingered for far too long. Frustration surged within me, a strong urge to confront whatever was holding us back, but the words eluded me. Finally, he stepped closer, his eyes searching mine with an intensity that made my heart skip. "Can we talk?" he asked, urgency lacing his tone. I nodded, unable to find my voice. He guided me into the living room, and we settled down, the tension between us almost tangible. He paused, fidgeting with his hands in his lap, before finally meeting my gaze. "I feel like there's something we need to address," he said, his voice barely above a murmur. "This tension between us. I don't know what it is, but it's driving me insane." His words sent a jolt through me, quickening my pulse and sending my thoughts racing. I found myself at a loss for words, unable to articulate the whirlwind of confusion that had taken root within me since that night. Yet, as I met his eyes, I recognized the same uncertainty and vulnerability reflected back at me. In that moment, it dawned on me that I wasn't the only one grappling with these feelings. "I don't know either," I confessed, my voice quivering slightly. "But I can't stop thinking about it." He nodded, a subtle smile playing on his lips. "Neither can I." We sat in silence, the tension that had hung between us finally acknowledged, and for the first time, I felt an unexpected sense of relief wash over me. It was as if simply admitting the tension had lightened the burden we both carried. Still, I understood that this was merely the beginning. There was so much left unspoken, so much we weren't ready to face. Yet, in that tranquil moment, with the afternoon sun pouring through the window, I experienced a peculiar sense of calm. No matter what unfolded next, I realized I wasn't alone in this. That realization made all the difference. The silence enveloped us, heavy yet oddly soothing. We both sensed it, a quiet understanding, an unvoiced bond that had somehow grown stronger over the past few days. Neither of us moved, suspended in a moment that felt more profound than anything we had ever shared. For the first time, I noticed a softness in his eyes, a vulnerability that mirrored my own. It was as if all the tension and confusion that had clouded our interactions had coalesced into this fragile connection between us. Sean's gaze held mine, steady and searching, as if he were looking for answers in my expression. My heart raced wildly, each thump echoing in my ears as the distance between us seemed to vanish with every fleeting moment. I yearned to break the silence, to voice the thoughts swirling in my mind, but the weight of the moment rendered me speechless. Without a second thought, I reached out, my fingers grazing his skin ever so softly. He tensed for a brief moment but didn't pull away. Instead, he exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding, his shoulders easing just a bit. His hand rose to meet mine, tentative at first, as if he were gauging the waters, before he gently wove his fingers through mine. The warmth of his touch ignited a spark within me, and I found it impossible to let go. We lingered in that shared silence, both enveloped in an unspoken connection. The atmosphere shifted, as if the world around us had narrowed down to just the two of us. Sean's gaze softened, his eyes drifting from my face to our entwined hands, as if he were trying to grasp the weight of this moment. Then, with a movement so subtle it was nearly unnoticeable, he leaned in closer. I could feel his warm breath against my cheek, sending a delightful shiver down my spine. My heart raced, and I instinctively leaned in as well, drawn to him in a way that felt destined, as if we had both been holding back for far too long. "Are you okay?" he whispered, his voice barely audible yet filled with a tenderness I had never heard before. I nodded, my heart pounding as I met his gaze. "Yeah," I replied softly, my voice almost hesitant. "I'm okay." His hand glided to my cheek, his fingers tracing a delicate path that sent a delightful shiver through me. There was an extraordinary gentleness in his touch, a silent promise of care and understanding that transcended words. He seemed to perceive every thought, every doubt and fear swirling within me, and in that instant, he offered a silent reassurance that I was not alone. I leaned into his touch, my breath hitching as he moved closer, our eyes locking in a gaze that spoke volumes beyond words. Then, in a moment that felt both destined and dreamlike, his lips brushed against mine, a gentle, tentative kiss that ignited a warmth within me. It was soft, almost shy, as if he were allowing me the option to retreat. But I didn't pull away. Instead, I found myself deepening the kiss, irresistibly drawn to him. The world around us faded, leaving only the sound of our quiet breaths and the gentle rhythm of our hearts beating in harmony. His hand found its way into my hair, his touch as light as a whisper, and I surrendered to the warmth of his embrace. There was a quiet intensity in that moment, a culmination of feelings that had been building between us for far too long, finally breaking free. We separated just for a heartbeat, our breaths mingling in the small space between us, and I could see the same wonder reflected in his eyes that I felt within. Are we really doing this?" he asked, his voice a mix of excitement and uncertainty. I met his gaze, my heart racing, and nodded. I think we are." His smile was soft, almost relieved, as he took my hand again, holding it gently as if afraid to let go. We sat close, enveloped in a silence that felt deeper than any words could express. The tension that had once loomed so heavily transformed into something entirely different, something delicate and precious. As the evening unfolded, we found ourselves engaged in quiet conversation, our voices low, each word carrying a significance that neither of us dared to disrupt. We exchanged stories and memories, revealing fragments of ourselves that had long been tucked away. With each shared word, the space between us seemed to dissolve, as if we were unearthing parts of each other that had been hidden under layers of facade and restraint. When the clock struck midnight, I was struck by how much time had slipped away, how deeply we had become entwined in one another's presence. I could feel the warmth of his hand enveloping mine, the steady beat of his heart resonating beside me as we sat together in a silence that felt more profound than anything I had ever known. He looked at me, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. "We should probably get some sleep," he murmured, his voice soft and almost hesitant. I nodded, a twinge of disappointment washing over me, yet I understood he was right. We couldn't linger in this moment forever, no matter how much I wished we could. Gradually, we both rose, neither of us eager to part just yet, and I could see the same reluctance mirrored in his eyes. Standing there, facing one another, I felt an overwhelming desire to reach out, to hold him just a little longer. As if he sensed my thoughts, he drew me into an embrace, his arms encircling me in a way that was both soothing and thrilling. I could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of his touch anchoring me, and I surrendered to the moment, cherishing every heartbeat. When we finally separated, an unspoken understanding lingered between us, a promise felt but not voiced. I watched him walk down the hall, his footsteps gentle and measured, and when he turned back for one last glance, a wave of warmth surged through me, igniting a flicker of hope that perhaps this was just the beginning. In the days that followed, we settled into a silent rhythm, a quiet closeness that seamlessly intertwined with our lives. Life continued as usual, with our daily routines and the mundane tasks that occupied our time. Yet, beneath the surface, there was a new bond forming, a connection that tied us together in ways I struggled to comprehend. Each glance, every shared smile, and those fleeting touches held a significance that transcended mere words. One afternoon, as we found ourselves alone in the house once more, I felt that familiar attraction, a magnetic pull that seemed to draw us closer with each passing second. In the kitchen, we were both engaged in our own activities when our eyes locked, and a wave of warmth washed over me. Janma. XW. E. Me. ANO@gmail.com. Before I realized it, he closed the gap between us, his hand enveloping mine. His touch was both gentle and reassuring, conveying a depth of feeling. In that silent moment, he leaned in, capturing my lips with his in a soft yet passionate kiss. Emotion surged within me, leaving me breathless. When we finally broke apart, our foreheads rested against each other, our breaths mingling in the air. His embrace wrapped around me like a warm shield, making the outside world fade away. Time stood still, and all my doubts evaporated. What remained was our undeniable bond. Every ounce of hesitation melted away, revealing a love that was pure and unfiltered. Our hearts beat in harmony, and our bodies moved together, lost in the intensity of our feelings. We had become two souls intertwined. When we finally separated, he gazed at me, his eyes radiating warmth and affection that made my heart race. "I'm not sure where this is headed," he said softly, his voice steady and resolute, "but I don't want to let it slip away." A wave of emotion surged through me, a blend of excitement and gratitude, and I nodded, my hand instinctively reaching to caress his face. "Me neither," I whispered, my voice barely above a murmur, but I knew he understood. We lingered there for a moment, wrapped in each other's arms, both enveloped in an emotion that felt too immense to articulate, too profound to overlook. This connection between us was delicate yet undeniably beautiful, illuminating every second with a newfound vibrancy. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue throughout the space, we reluctantly separated, each of us aware that this was merely the start of something significant. Questions loomed and uncertainties swirled, but for the first time, a sense of tranquility washed over me, a quiet assurance that we were precisely where we were meant to be. Standing together in the warm evening light, I realized that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would confront them united, side by side. The weeks that followed unfolded like a gentle whirlwind of feelings, an unspoken rhythm we had seamlessly slipped into. It was an unusual routine, characterized by lingering glances and casual touches that carried a weight we both hesitated to acknowledge. Each moment was charged with its own excitement, a subtle thrill that quickened my heartbeat. There were days when my concentration faltered, when I found myself anticipating that one serendipitous encounter in the hallway, that tiny spark that seemed to ignite everything around us. One rainy afternoon, as the sound of raindrops drummed against the windows, I found myself in the kitchen, mindlessly flipping through a magazine. The house was quiet, the stillness wrapping around me like a warm embrace. Then, as if summoned by my thoughts, Sean appeared in the doorway, his hair slightly damp and his gaze focused. "Hey," he said, his voice soft and almost hesitant. "Hey," I replied, feeling that familiar flutter in my chest as he moved closer to stand beside me. There was a gentle glow in his eyes, a silent curiosity that seemed to pull us together without uttering a single word. Time slipped away as we remained quiet, both of us seemingly hesitant to disrupt the serene atmosphere that enveloped us. Then, unexpectedly, he reached out, his fingers grazing mine, a light touch that sent a spark through me. I looked up, locking eyes with him, and in that instant, I felt everything. The unvoiced questions, the building anticipation, the subtle thrill that had lingered between us for what felt like an eternity. Without a second thought, I leaned closer, our breaths intertwining in the small gap that separated us. He paused, his hand hovering near my face, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. But just as swiftly, his expression softened, and his hand settled gently against my cheek. The warmth of his touch radiated through me, anchoring me in the moment, and I closed my eyes, allowing the sensation to envelop me. When I opened them again, he was still there, his gaze locked onto mine with a tenderness that left me breathless. I nodded, speechless, and leaned into him, surrendering to the warmth of his embrace. It felt as if every wall between us had crumbled, revealing the raw, unfiltered connection that had always existed. In that instant, nothing else mattered. The uncertainties, the questions, the doubts faded away, leaving just the two of us. We remained in that space for a while, immersed in the profound intensity of the moment, neither of us eager to break the enchantment. Outside, the world continued its steady pace, but within those walls, time felt suspended. I could sense the rhythm of his heartbeat against mine, the warmth of his breath, and in that shared silence, I discovered a peace I hadn't felt in years. Eventually, we drew apart, our hands still intertwined, and he gazed at me with a softness I had never witnessed before. He confessed, his voice tinged with a subtle vulnerability, that he was uncertain about what lay ahead. Yet, he was certain of one thing: he didn't want this to come to an end. I inhaled deeply, a blend of excitement and apprehension swirling within me, and nodded in agreement. "Me neither," I replied softly, knowing he could hear me. The evening unfolded in a comfortable silence, both of us lost in our thoughts, but connected by an unspoken understanding. The atmosphere felt transformed, as if the world had subtly shifted in ways I couldn't articulate. Yet, the steadiness in his eyes provided a reassuring promise that we would navigate whatever came next together. Days melted into weeks, each filled with a quiet thrill that simmered just beneath the surface. It was as if the very air around us had become charged, making every glance and touch feel profoundly significant. We maintained our routine, acting as if we were merely family, but the bond between us was undeniable. One evening, while sitting on the back porch under a canopy of stars, he took my hand, intertwining his fingers with mine. I turned to him, my heart racing, and he offered a soft, genuine smile that illuminated his face. "This," he said, his voice filled with awe, "is what I've been missing." A warmth enveloped me as I leaned into him, relishing the serene peace that surrounded us. Outside, life continued its relentless march, but in that moment, we found perfect contentment and stillness. Words were unnecessary. Everything we needed was encapsulated in the gentle rhythm of our breaths and the warmth of our joined hands. Yet, as life often does, it had other plans in store. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of upheaval and transformation. The announcement of an unanticipated family reunion drew relatives from every corner of the nation, infusing our home with a vibrant energy and noise we hadn't felt in years. The peaceful solitude we had come to treasure was swiftly overshadowed by a continuous flow of chatter, laughter, and the clinking of dishes as family members occupied every nook and cranny. We found ourselves swept up in the chaos, navigating a distance that felt both known and oddly unfamiliar. It was as if the connection we had nurtured, the bond that had flourished between us, was suddenly obscured by layers of routine and familial obligations. There were fleeting moments when our eyes would lock across the room, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that lingered just beneath the surface. One evening, after the house had finally quieted down, I stepped outside, grateful for the cool night air that offered a respite from the warmth and clamor within. Leaning against the porch railing, I savored the tranquility of the night when I heard footsteps approaching. I turned to see him standing a few paces away, his expression inscrutable. "I thought I'd find you out here," he said softly as he joined me at the railing. We stood in silence, the stillness of the night enveloping us like an old friend. For a brief moment, it felt as if we were the only two souls in existence, the rest of the house fading into obscurity. "It's been different, hasn't it?" he asked, his voice tinged with a quiet melancholy. I nodded, a wave of nostalgia washing over me. "Yes, I truly miss this." He met my eyes, his expression brimming with a softness that left me breathless. "So do I," he murmured, his fingers gently grazing mine. The contact was brief, a fleeting echo of our past, yet it ignited a warmth within me. We lingered in that moment, neither of us eager to break the spell, as if clinging to it could prevent it from fading away. The night unfolded around us, the world quiet and serene, and in that stillness, I felt the profound bond that had blossomed between us. However, as days passed, the weight of reality began to creep in, casting a shadow over the warmth we had experienced. The gatherings, the daily routines, the expectations, they all felt suffocating, closing in on us like a tightening grip. It was as if the universe had shifted, dragging us back into a reality we desperately sought to escape. One evening, while the family buzzed with farewells and goodbyes, I found myself alone in the kitchen, lost in my thoughts. The house echoed with laughter and chatter, yet I felt an odd sense of disconnection, yearning for the quiet moments we had cherished. He appeared in the doorway, his gaze piercing, and I felt that familiar flutter in my heart. We shared a silent glance, an unspoken understanding, and in that instant, I realized this was our farewell. Not for eternity, but for this moment. As we stood amidst the lively chaos of family, a wave of tranquility washed over me, bringing a quiet acceptance of all that had transpired. The bond we forged, the memories we treasured, would forever be imprinted in my mind, a testament to a connection that was both transient and deeply significant. Words were unnecessary. A gentle nod, a warm smile, and the shared understanding that some of the most impactful connections defy definition. As he faded into the throng, a sense of serenity enveloped me, a reassuring thought that whatever lay ahead, we would carry this moment forward, a cherished fragment of our narrative that time could not tarnish. Ultimately, it wasn't about how it began or how it would end. It was about the journey, the ephemeral beauty of a bond that had changed us in unexpected ways. And as the evening unfolded, filled with laughter and reminiscences, I realized that some stories are meant to be treasured, held dear, even if just for a fleeting, invaluable moment.